The wind howled through the lonely Cherokee hills, carrying with it the faint whispers of the past. Songs once sung around sacred fires, laughter that once echoed through the forests, and prayers that once rose to the heavens. Now those hills were silent. Where there had once been thriving villages, only empty cabins and trampled earth remained. The white settlers had come like a rising tide, pushing the Cherokee people from their ancestral lands, driving them farther south, farther, into exile. But a hive, a young Cherokee widow of barely 22 summers, had refused to leave. Her heart was tethered to this land, to the ridges where she and her husband had hunted, to the streams where they had whispered their dreams beneath the starlit skies. This was where he had been buried beneath the roots of the old cedar tree, the one he had promised would guard their spirits forever. But promises did little to keep her alive. Ahib's world had collapsed the night Dakota, her husband, fell. It had been sudden, a violent clash between her people and land-hungry ranchers who came with rifles and greed in their eyes. She still remembered the way Dakota's blood had stained the earth beneath him, the way he had whispered her name before the light left his eyes. That was 6 months ago. 6 months of wandering these hills, clinging to memories while her body wasted away. Now winter had crept over the land like a predator stalking its prey. The forest offered little. The rivers were frozen, game was scarce, and her traps lay empty. Her once strong frame had grown thin. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked from thirst and cold. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. On this particular day, the sky was bruised with clouds, threatening snow. A hive staggered along a narrow deer path, clutching a tattered shawl around her shoulders. Hunger gnawed at her insides like a wild animal, and dizziness blurred her vision. Still, she pressed on, whispering under her breath the old Cherokee prayer for strength, though her voice trembled with exhaustion. Unalanvi, give me the breath to walk one more step. But even prayers seemed to drift unanswered in these. Dying hills dot, she stopped beneath an ancient oak, leaning against its rough bark for support. Her breath came out in short, shallow gasps, each one visible in the cold air. From up here, she could see the rolling hills stretch endlessly into the distance, ridges carved by time, valleys kissed by fading sunlight. And yet, despite its beauty, the land felt hollow, empty. Like her, she thought about following the rest of her people south, where her aunt had promised safety, food, and shelter. But leaving would mean abandoning Dakota's grave, abandoning the last piece of him she still held close. She had sworn to stay, but now she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. Her legs buckled suddenly, and she dropped to her knees, clutching at the frozen earth. Her vision spun wildly, the world tilting and collapsing all at once. She felt warmth trickling from a fresh cut on her palm, but she didn't care. Her thoughts drifted back to Dakota. She could almost see him standing at the edge of the ridge, tall and strong, his long black hair whipping in the wind. He smiled at her, just as he had the night before the raid, when they had spoken of starting a family. "You're not alone, Hive," his voice seemed to say. Though it was only memory, but memory couldn't warm her. She stumbled forward, desperate to reach the small cabin she had once called home, but her strength was gone. Her bare feet scraped against rocks, leaving faint streaks of blood where her skin tore. Each breath rattled painfully in her chest, each step weaker than the last. Finally, her body gave out entirely. She collapsed near a rocky ridge, the damp earth cold beneath her cheek. The world faded into shades of gray as the first flakes of snow drifted down from the darkening sky. For a moment, she thought she heard drumming, the heartbeat of the earth calling her home. Perhaps it was the ancestors welcoming her spirit. Perhaps this was how it would end, quiet and unseen, swallowed by the hills that had witnessed her love, her loss, and now her surrender. Her eyes fluttered closed. The cold bit deeper, numbing. Her fingers, her lips, her very breath. The sky above her blurred into a silver haze. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, circling high, as if marking the passing of a soul. "Dakota," she whispered weakly, her voice little more than a sigh, and then there was silence. The hills held their breath. The wind slowed, the snow thickened, and time itself seemed to pause. Unseen by a hive, a lone rider approached from the west. A man astride a dark chestnut stallion, his silhouette cutting against the pale horizon. He was heading toward the ridge, where she lay, but for a hive, in that moment, there was only darkness and the faint memory of a promise beneath a cedar tree. The sun dipped low across the Cherokee hills, its dying light staining the sky with streaks of orange and crimson. The wind carried the sharp bite of winter, whispering across the ridges and rattling the bare branches of skeletal trees. Somewhere, in the distance, a lone stallion's hooves struck the frozen earth in steady rhythm, the sound echoing faintly through the empty valleys. Colton Hayes rode silently, his broad shoulders hunched slightly beneath a worn brown duster, a black Stetson. Esatillo over his brow, shading his piercing gray eyes from the fading sun. At 33, he was already a man carved by hardship, strong in body, but scarred in ways that weren't visible to the eye. The locals called him the wealthy Hayes rancher, but those who really knew him, and there were few, understood he wasn't a man who cared for riches. His sprawling ranch had been built on sweat and stubbornness, not inheritance. Yet, despite his success, there was a quiet emptiness inside him. Once years ago, he had known love. Once, his laughter had filled a modest home nestled by the creek. But disease had swept through the region 5 winters back, stealing his wife, Amelia, and their unborn child before he could even say goodbye. Since then, Colton had lived like a man wandering through life without a map, his heart buried beneath the walls he'd built around himself. Tonight, however, his thoughts weren't on the past. He'd ridden out into the hills tracking 3 missing cattle, determined to find them before the storm rolling in from the west hit full force. His stallion, Gunner, snorted sharply, its breath steaming in the cold air. Colton patted the animals. "Neck. Easy, boy," he murmured, scanning the ground ahead. "Tracks gotta be around here somewhere." The hills were quiet, too quiet. Even the usual chatter of birds and rustle of small creatures had stilled, as if the land itself was holding its breath. And then he saw something. A dark shape sprawled near the ridge ahead, half hidden by dry brush and patches of frost. At first, Colton thought it was just another fallen branch or maybe a deer carcass. But something in his gut told him otherwise. He nudged Gunner forward cautiously. The closer he got, the clearer the form became, a woman lying motionless on the ground. Her shawl was torn, her long raven-black hair tangled with leaves and dirt. Colton's breath caught in his throat. He swung down from his saddle in one swift motion, boots crunching against the frozen soil as he rushed to her side. Kneeling, he brushed away the damp strands of hair clinging to her face and felt a sharp pang at what he saw. Her cheeks were sunken, her lips cracked and pale. The thinness of her body spoke of weeks, maybe months, of starvation. A fresh scrape ran along her temple where she must have fallen. Her breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest faint and uneven. "She's Cherokee," whispered under his breath, noting the delicate beaded pendant around her neck, a tribal symbol he recognized. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Helping her could mean trouble. Tensions between white settlers and the Cherokee were at an all-time high. He'd heard the angry whispers in town, the warnings to stay out of Cherokee affairs. Bringing her to his ranch could draw suspicion, even hostility. But then he looked at her again, really looked. There was something fragile yet fierce about her. Even now, in this broken state, her face carried traces of dignity, of a strength that refused to bow completely. And suddenly, Colton didn't care about town gossip or the danger or anything else. He slid his arms beneath her, lifting her. With surprising gentleness. She weighed almost nothing, her body cold as river stone. "Easy there," he murmured softly, though she couldn't hear him. "I got you." Gunner shifted restlessly as Colton mounted with her in his arms, securing her carefully against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, a faint whisper escaping her cracked lips. A single word in Cherokee he didn't understand out as he turned Gunner back toward the ranch. The first flakes of snow began to fall, swirling in the growing wind. Ride back was slow and silent, the storm closing in around them. Colton kept his coat wrapped tightly around the woman, shielding her from the icy gusts. He could feel the weak flutter of her heartbeat against his chest, faint, but still there. "Hang on," he muttered under his breath, spurring Gunner gently forward. "Just hang on." With every passing minute, memories of Amelia haunted him. He remembered holding her the same way when the fever had taken her strength, whispering promises he couldn't keep. He had failed to save her, but he wasn't going to fail this time. By the time the ranch lights came into view, night had fully descended, the hills swallowed in darkness and snow. Colton dismounted quickly, cradling the woman in his arms as he kicked open the heavy wooden door of his house. Inside, the fire in the hearth had burned low, but the warmth was a welcome relief. He laid her gently on the old leather sofa near the flames, removing her soaked shawl and boots. "Damn it," he muttered, his jaw tight. "You're half frozen." Grabbing a thick quilt, he wrapped her tightly and hurried to fetch water and bread. It wasn't much, but it was something. He propped her head carefully, coaxing a few drops of water past her lips. For a long moment, he sat beside her, watching the firelight dance across her face. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why did saving her feel like saving a part of himself? Outside, the storm raged across the hills, but inside Colton's ranch, the quiet crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of her breathing became the only sounds. She would live. He promised himself that much, but Colton Hayes had no idea that by carrying this Cherokee widow into his home, he had set events in motion that would change both of their lives forever. The soft crackle of a fire whispered in the silence. A hive stirred, her lashes fluttering against her cold cheeks as her body fought to wake. At first, she thought she was dead. There was warmth against her skin, the distant sound of wood popping in a hearth, and the faint smell of leather and cedar smoke. Nothing like the frozen earth where she remembered collapsing. Her fingers twitched against something soft beneath her, and when she finally opened her eyes, she found herself staring up at a wooden ceiling. Shadows from the fire danced across the beams, glowing amber and gold. Confusion swept through her like a rising tide. She pushed herself up sharply, gasping, but the sudden movement sent a bolt of pain tearing through her ribs. Her hand flew to her chest instinctively as her breath caught. "Where am I?" Her dark eyes darted around the room. It was large but quiet, built of rich timber with thick curtains drawn against the cold night. A worn leather sofa sat near the fireplace, where she now lay wrapped in a heavy quilt that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. There were polished bookshelves against one wall, a sturdy oak table at the center, and a rifle mounted above the mantel. This was no Cherokee cabin. Panic clawed at her chest as realization struck. A white man's home. Her heart pounded violently as she scanned for an escape. But before she could rise, a shadow moved in the doorway. "You're awake." The deep voice was calm, low, but it made her flinch instinctively. Colton Hayes stepped into the room, carrying a steaming mug between his calloused hands. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, his dark duster still damp from melted snow. He paused when he saw the fear in her wide eyes, his jaw tightening slightly before he spoke. "Again, you're safe," he said quietly, keeping his distance. "You collapsed out by the ridge. I brought you here." A hive didn't answer. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself, her breath uneven, mistrust burning in her gaze. She'd heard stories of wealthy ranchers, men who took what they wanted, who saw Cherokee lives as expendable. Colton set the mug on the small table near her without coming closer. "It's just tea," he said, nodding to it, "for the cold." Her silence was sharp enough to cut through the air. For a long moment, neither moved. The only sound was the soft hiss of logs burning in the hearth. Finally, Colton spoke again, his voice rough but patient. "You don't have to stay. Once you're strong enough, you can leave. But for now, you need rest." He turned as if to go, giving her space, but her voice, raspy from thirst, stopped him. "Why?" She whispered doubt. He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Why what? Why help me?" Colton hesitated. The question dug deeper than she realized, unearthing pieces of himself he rarely touched. After a long silence, he said quietly, "Because I couldn't walk away." There was weight behind those words, something unsaid. A hive saw it in his eyes, a shadow, a loss, a hurt that mirrored her own. Still, she didn't trust him. Couldn't. When he left the room, she finally reached for the tea. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. She sipped cautiously, the bitterness of the brew grounding her, reminding her she was alive. The next few days blurred into fragments. She slept more than she woke, her body slowly regaining strength. Each time she opened her eyes, she noticed more about the ranch, the neat orderliness of the place, the worn books stacked by the hearth, the tools arranged carefully by the door. Everything here spoke of a man who valued control, yet traces of loneliness clung to the air like dust. Colton rarely lingered in the room with her, but she caught glimpses of him, chopping firewood outside, tending to the horses, mending a fence with quiet focus. Always moving, as if idleness left too much room for ghosts to creep in. Despite herself, she found her gaze drawn to him when he was near. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the steady calm of someone who didn't need to prove his strength. He was careful with her, never stepping too close, never pressing her with questions, but the outside world was less forgiving. On the third day, when she ventured to the window, she saw two riders down by the main gate. Colton met them, his stance tense but controlled. Though she couldn't hear the words exchanged, she read the hostility in the men's gestures, the way one jabbed a finger toward the house. Rumors had spread out by evening. Colton returned to the ranch with his jaw set tight, his gray eyes unreadable. She didn't ask what happened, but she didn't need to. She already knew her presence here wasn't welcome. That night, as the wind howled outside, a hive sat curled on the sofa, staring into the flames. "You should have left me," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but sharp. Colton glanced up from where he was oiling his rifle. "Don't say that." "It's true," she insisted, her gaze fixed on the fire. "The people in town, they'll hate you for this, for helping me." "Let them," he said simply. She turned to look at him then, searching his face for mockery, for pity, but found neither. "Why?" she asked again, softer this time. Colton set the rifle down and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. For a long moment, he stared into the flames before answering. 5 years ago, he began slowly, I held my wife while she died. Fever took her and our child before I could do a damn thing. A hive blinked, caught off guard by the quiet grief in his voice. "I couldn't save them," he continued, "but I wasn't about to ride past you and let history repeat itself." The words hung heavy between them. Thick with meaning neither dared unravel further. For the first time in months, a hive felt something stir inside her chest. Something she'd thought long dead. It wasn't trust. Not yet, but it was the faintest thread of understanding. Still, her heart remained guarded. She was Cherokee. He was a wealthy rancher. Two worlds divided by blood, history, and scars too deep to heal overnight. Yet, as she watched the way Colton tended to the fire, as if keeping it alive mattered more than anything, she couldn't deny the quiet truth settling like embers inside her. For the first time since Dakota's death, she wasn't entirely alone. Outside, the snow fell silently over the hills, blanketing the world in white. Inside the ranch, two broken souls sat by the fire, strangers bound by pain, circling cautiously around the fragile beginnings of something neither fully understood. Neither knew it yet, but their lives had already begun to entwine, setting them on a path that would test loyalty, identity, and the boundaries of the heart. The wind carried a restless chill across the hills, rattling the bare branches outside Colton Hayes' ranch. Winter had tightened its grip, but inside the ranch house, the fire crackled steadily, casting long shadows that danced across the timber walls. A hive sat near the hearth, her knees drawn up beneath the thick quilt Colton had given her. The warmth of the flames licked her chilled skin, but it did little to soothe the storm inside her. The last few days had been strange. She was regaining strength, the hollow ache of hunger slowly fading, yet every time she closed her eyes, the memories returned, fragments of screams, of rifles cracking, of smoke spiraling into the night sky. The night Dakota died played on repeat in her mind like a cruel ghost refusing to release her. And now, sitting here in the home of a white rancher, surrounded by objects that belonged to the very world her husband had fought against, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. Coffee? Colton's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He stood by the table, holding out a steaming mug. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. Watto, she murmured softly, thanking him in Cherokee. He handed it to her without a word, lowering himself into the chair opposite hers. He'd learned not to push her into conversation. She spoke when she wanted to, silent when she didn't. For a few moments, the only sound was the low hiss of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. Then Colton leaned back, resting his forearms on the chair. They came by again today, he said quietly. A hive looked up sharply. Who? Darnell's men. His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. Wanted to know why I'm harboring you? Told them it wasn't their damn business. Her fingers tightened around the mug, the heat burning into her palms, grounding her. She'd heard of Elias Darnell even before Dakota died, a ruthless land speculator who made his fortune by forcing Cherokee families off their ancestral lands, buying them for pennies, then reselling to settlers at 10 times their worth. He won't stop, she whispered, almost to herself. Colton's gray eyes met hers. Let him try, she shook her head. You don't understand. Darnell, he killed Dakota. The words were quiet, but they landed heavy, like stones sinking into deep water. Colton froze. What? Her breath trembled, but she forced herself to continue. The night the raid came, it was Darnell's men. They came with torches, drove us from our home. Dakota tried to fight back. He wouldn't leave his father's land. Her voice broke, the memories clawing up from where she'd buried them. They shot him right there, under the cedar tree. Colton's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking along his cheek. His hand curled slowly into a fist against his knee. He's been buying up land from my people for years, she continued bitterly. The rest of my family fled south, but I stayed. I thought if I kept close, I could protect what was left. Her gaze dropped to the floor, shame flickering in her eyes. Instead, I almost died out there. Silence hung thick between them. Colton leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low but steady. "You listen to me, Ahive," he said firmly. "You didn't almost die because you're weak. You survived 6 months out there on your own. That takes more grit than most folks I know." Her throat tightened at his words. No one had ever spoken to her like that since Dakota. Still, her eyes darted toward the window where the snow drifted softly against the glass. "If Darnell knows I'm here, he'll come for me, and he won't care what he destroys to get me." Colton's expression hardened. "Then let him come." She stared at him. Stunned out, he rose from his chair, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor as he moved to the rifle mounted above the mantel. With deliberate care, he checked the chamber before setting it down within easy reach. "No one sets foot on this ranch unless I let him," he said flatly. Darnell included. That night, Ahive couldn't sleep. She lay on the sofa, listening to the creak of the old house and the distant coyote calls carried on the wind. Across the room, Colton sat at the table, boots propped on the edge, sharpening his knife by the dim light of a lantern. There was something steady about him, something solid, like the hills themselves. But there was something broken, too. She saw it in the quiet way he stared into the fire when he thought she wasn't looking, in the haunted weight behind his silences. For the first time since Dakota's death, she wondered if maybe she wasn't the only one carrying ghosts. 2 days later, the storm arrived. Snow blanketed the ranch, turning the hills into rolling drifts of white. Colton was out early, chopping firewood when Ahive heard the crunch of wagon wheels on frozen earth. She hurried to the window, heart pounding as she spotted 3 riders approaching the ranch gate. At the front was Elias Darnell himself, a tall, broad man dressed in a tailored black coat and polished boots, his cold smile cutting like a knife. Colton dropped the axe and strode to meet him. Ahive couldn't hear their words, but she could see Darnell's gestures, the way he jabbed. A finger toward the house, his voice rising with agitation. Colton didn't flinch, standing his ground with calm defiance. Finally, Darnell turned his horse sharply, spitting into the snow before riding off, his men following close behind. When Colton came back inside, his jaw was set like stone. "What did he want?" she asked quietly. "For you," he said simply. "And if you give me up," she said softly, "he'll leave you alone." Colton's gaze locked with hers, hard and unwavering. "That's not happening." Something in her chest shifted at his words, a crack in the wall she'd built around herself that evening. As the wind screamed through the hills, Ahive sat by the fire and began to speak softly, almost hesitantly, about her past. She told Colton about the river where she and Dakota had met, about the cedar tree where they'd promised each other forever, about the night the world ended in flames. Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop, as if speaking the memories aloud was the only way to keep them from consuming her. Colton didn't interrupt. He just listened, his steady presence anchoring her when her words faltered. When she finally fell silent, he spoke for the first time. "You deserved better than what the world's given you," he said quietly. She met his gaze across the firelight, and for the first time in months, she didn't look away. Outside, the hills slept beneath their blanket of snow. But inside Colton's ranch, something fragile was stirring, an unspoken bond. A shared understanding between 2 souls who had lost everything, yet somehow found each other in the wreckage. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both knew. The peace wouldn't last out because Elias Darnell wasn't finished, and when he came back, he wouldn't come alone. The soft golden glow of dawn spilled over the endless Cherokee hills, painting them in hues of amber and rose, but for Leah, the morning felt heavy and uncertain. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wildflowers and damp earth, yet beneath its freshness lay a tension she could not shake. After weeks of quiet recovery under Jacob's roof, her body was healing, but her Her heart remained torn. Inside Jacob's sprawling ranch house, the day had already begun. The rhythmic clatter of hooves came from the corral where ranch hands were training wild mustangs, and the distant whinny of horses echoed across the open plains. But Leah stood by the window of the guest room, clutching the shawl Jacob had given her, staring out at the horizon. For the first time since he had saved her from the cold grip of death in the hills, Leah felt like an outsider again. She'd overheard whispers among the townsfolk when Jacob took her to town for supplies. "That Cherokee girl's cursed," one woman had murmured. "The rancher's gone soft," another man spat, shaking his head. Those words clung to her skin like frostbite. They reminded her that, no matter how kind Jacob had been, she didn't belong to his world, and his world didn't want her. Downstairs, Jacob was at the kitchen table, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug, his gaze distant. The ranch house felt emptier than usual. Despite his wealth and the hundreds of acres under his name, there was a loneliness in him he couldn't shake, a hollowness carved by years of losing people he loved. When Leah appeared in the doorway, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor, he looked up. "You're awake early," he said softly, setting the mug aside. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, then added, I think I should leave soon." Jacob froze. He had expected this moment to come, but hearing it out loud still hit him like a hammer. He pushed back his chair and stood slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow across the sunlit room. "Why?" he asked, his tone gentle but edged with hurt. Leah lowered her gaze. "People talk, Jacob. They don't want me here. I'm not like them, and I never will be." He crossed the room, stopping just short of her, resisting the urge to reach out. "I don't give a damn what they say," he said, his voice roughened by emotion. "You belong where you're safe. And here, with me, you are safe." For a fleeting second, she believed him. But safety was only part of the story. Acceptance was another. And her people, the Cherokee, had always taught her that the earth remembers where you come from. Later that afternoon, as Leah walked through the sprawling meadow behind the ranch, the sound of distant drums reached her ears. Her heart stilled. Turning toward the tree line, she saw them, a small group of Cherokee riders approaching. Among them was Chief Noken, a stern elder from her village, and two women she recognized from her childhood. Jacob, alerted by one of his ranch hands, strode out to meet them, his boots crunching against the dry earth. His broad shoulders squared, his jaw set. He positioned himself slightly ahead of Leah without thinking, protective as ever. Noken dismounted first, his lined face unreadable. His gaze shifted from Leah to Jacob, then back to Leah. "We came for you," Noken said in Cherokee, his voice deep and steady. Leah stepped forward cautiously. "Why?" she asked in the same tongue. "The hills whisper of you," he replied. "A widow, lost and found by a white man." "You are Cherokee, Leah. You belong with your people." Her throat tightened. She glanced back at Jacob, who couldn't understand the words but read the situation in their tones and faces. His hand flexed at his side, restless, as if he feared she might slip away from him right there. Leah faltered, caught between two worlds that had never learned to exist together. That night, the ranch house was quiet, but no one slept. Leah sat by the window, staring at the moonlit hills, her mind swirling. Jacob eventually knocked gently on her door and entered without waiting for an answer. "You're leaving, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost broken. Leah didn't reply immediately. Instead, she met his gaze, tears shimmering in her dark eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "They are my people, Jacob, but you," her voice caught, "you saved my life. You gave me a reason to breathe again." He stepped closer, finally allowing himself to touch her hand, his rough palm warm against her trembling fingers. "I didn't save you," he whispered. "You saved me." The words hung between them like a fragile thread, fragile but unbreakable. The following days were a storm of choices and consequences. The Cherokee delegation camped nearby, waiting patiently while the townsfolk's murmurs grew louder. Some accused Jacob of betrayal, of bringing trouble onto the ranch. Others warned him that keeping Leah there would invite war. Yet Jacob stood firm, unyielding as the land itself. "She's under my protection," he told anyone who dared confront him. "And no man or law will change that." Leah watched him from a distance, torn between gratitude and guilt. The weight of her people's expectations pressed against the quiet longing blooming inside her. Could she truly stay in a world that had always scorned her? Could she walk away from the one man who had looked at her and seen her, not her blood, not her scars? One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Leah climbed the ridge above the ranch. The wind tangled her dark hair as she looked out over the endless land, Jacob's land. But now intertwined with her story, Jacob joined her moments later, standing silently at her side. The horizon stretched before them, vast and unbroken. "Don't have to decide tonight," he said softly, sensing the turmoil within her. She turned to face him, her breath catching at the sincerity in his gaze. "But I have to decide soon," she whispered, and beneath that setting sun, two souls stood on the edge of something bigger than either of them, a love caught between blood and belonging, past and future, tradition and freedom. This was not just Leah's struggle anymore. It was theirs. And as the wind swept across the open plains, carrying the distant sound of drums and the rustle of wild grass, both of them knew that the hardest choice still lay ahead. The golden sun stretched its first rays across the rolling Cherokee ridge, painting the sky in strokes of amber and rose. Dew clung to the wildflowers, and the chirping of meadowlarks echoed softly through the valley. For the first time in many years, the land seemed alive again, as though it had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. Ayanna stood at the edge of the hill, her long dark hair fluttering gently in the cool morning breeze. Her copper-toned skin glowed under the soft light, and her dark, soulful eyes shimmered with a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. Just months ago, she had been a shadow of herself, a young Cherokee widow dying slowly in the cold mountains, her spirit nearly extinguished by hunger, loneliness, and grief. But now, everything had changed. Behind her stood the sprawling ranch, Cole Matthews Ranch, its fences repaired, barns freshly painted, and pastures teeming with life. Cattle grazed peacefully, and a handful of Cherokee families worked alongside the ranch hands, laughing as they drove the calves toward the water troughs. It was a sight Ayanna had never thought she'd see, her people and the settlers working side by side. Cole stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a piece of cloth. His tall frame cast a long shadow, and his blue-gray eyes found Ayanna immediately as though drawn by instinct. He walked toward her slowly, boots crunching softly against the gravel. "You're up early," he said with a faint smile, stopping beside her. "I wanted to see the sun rise," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "Back in the hills. I used to tell little sparrow stories about the Great Spirit painting the sky each morning. But lately, I never thought I'd live to see another dawn." Cole glanced at her, and for a moment, he couldn't find his voice. The memory of finding her half-frozen in those hills, clinging desperately to her daughter, still haunted him. She had been so fragile, her breath shallow, her spirit dim, and yet she had clung to life with a fierceness he had never seen before. "You fought for her," he said finally, nodding toward the small figure skipping across the yard. Little Sparrow, her 6-year-old daughter, ran barefoot through the grass. chasing a butterfly, her laughter carrying through the morning air like a soft melody. For a child who had known so much loss, her joy now was almost miraculous. Ayanna smiled faintly. I fought because she deserved better than what the world had given us. She paused, glancing up at him. You gave her that chance, Cole. He shook his head, stepping closer. No, you saved her. You survived when most wouldn't have. I just gave you a place to rest. But Ayanna knew better. Without him, without his stubborn insistence on taking them in, without his protection, against those who saw her people as nothing more than burdens, she would not be standing there now. And somewhere deep inside, she knew Cole had saved more than just their lives. He had saved a part of her heart she thought was lost forever. That day, the ranch bustled with preparations. Cole had invited the Cherokee elders, nearby settlers, and even a few ranchers from town to a gathering, a chance to talk, to share food, and to rebuild trust. It wasn't easy. The wounds between their peoples ran deep. But Cole believed that if they could start here on this ranch, maybe something new could grow. Ayanna spent the morning helping in the kitchen, grinding corn for bread, while the older Cherokee women prepared venison stew. The smell filled the air, mingling with the rich aroma of roasting coffee. Every so often, she caught Cole glancing her way from across the yard as he worked with the ranch hands, and every time their eyes met, her cheeks warmed slightly. By afternoon, families arrived. At first, there was tension in the air. Cherokee warriors stood tall and guarded, while settlers shifted uneasily, their hands never far from their belts. But Little Sparrow, unaware of these old grudges, ran up to a settler's daughter and offered her a flower. The little girl hesitated, then smiled and took it. That simple gesture broke something open. Laughter followed soon after, and soon children from both sides were running and playing together under the wide-open sky. Cole watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction, then turned to Ayanna. It's working, he murmured. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Maybe the land is teaching us, she whispered. It gives enough for everyone, if we learn to share it. That night, when the guests had left and the stars blanketed the sky, Cole found Ayanna sitting on the ranch porch, rocking gently in a wooden chair. He sat beside her, silent for a while, letting the sounds of crickets and the distant howls of coyotes fill the space between them. I've been thinking, he said softly. About what? She asked, turning her gaze toward him. About us. He admitted, his voice deep and careful. About what comes next. Her heart skipped. For weeks, she had felt something growing between them, something neither of them had dared to name. She looked away, her fingers tightening on the edge of her shawl. Cole? I know you've lost so much, he said gently, leaning forward. I know your heart still carries scars. I'd never ask you to forget who you are or where you came from. But I also know this, I don't want to walk this land without you by my side. Tears welled in Ayanna's eyes. She thought of her late husband, of the cold nights when grief had been her only companion, of the endless hunger and fear. And now here was this man offering her something she had thought she'd never have again, a future. I'm afraid, she whispered. I am too, Cole confessed, his voice rough. But maybe we can be afraid together. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. Above them, a shooting star blazed across the sky, as though the heavens themselves were blessing this fragile, precious beginning. Weeks later, under the vast open skies of Cherokee Ridge, Cole and Ayanna were joined in a quiet ceremony, not a grand affair, but one filled with meaning. Cherokee chants blended with soft hymns, and settlers stood alongside Ayanna's people, united in hope. As they exchanged vows, Little Sparrow stood between them, holding both their hands, giggling softly as the wind caught her braids. From that day forward, the ranch became more than just land. It became a home, a place where two worlds once divided learned to grow together. And as Ayanna walked the hills at sunset, Cole's arm wrapped around her shoulders, she whispered softly to herself, "The Great Spirit brought me here. He gave me a second chance." Cole kissed her temple, his voice low but certain. "No, Ayanna, you were always meant to be here." The wind swept through the grass, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow, and for the first time in years, Ayanna felt truly, deeply alive.